The grease trap needed cleaning again. Zara Chin wiped her hands on the stained apron tied around her waist, glancing at the clock above the order window. 11:30 on a Tuesday night, and the downtown diner was finally empty except for the lingering smell of burnt coffee and the hum of fluorescent lights that flickered every few seconds. Where are you watching from tonight? I always wonder about the places we call home, the neighborhoods that shape us before we know we need shaping. Drop a comment and let me know your corner of the world. She'd been on her feet for 14 hours straight, pulling a double shift because Maya called in sick again. The tips tonight barely covered her bus fare home, but rent was due in 3 days and the electric company had already sent 2 notices. Her sneakers squeaked against the greasy linoleum as she moved between tables, stacking plates with mechanical precision. The sound hit her just as she reached for the last coffee cup. A sharp cry, high and desperate, cutting through the ambient noise of the city. Zara froze, listening. There was again, a child's voice, terrified and pleading in a language she didn't recognize. She dropped the dishes back onto the table and moved toward the rear exit, her heart already racing. The alley behind the diner was notorious for drug deals and worse, but that was definitely a kid out there. A kid in trouble. The heavy steel door opened with a screech that announced her presence to anyone listening. The alley stretched before her, narrow and poorly lit, lined with dumpsters and fire escapes that dripped with condensation. The smell hit her immediately. Garbage, urine, and something else. Fear. 3 men had cornered a small figure against the brick wall of the adjacent building. The child couldn't have been more than 8 or 9 years old, dressed in clothes that looked expensive even in the dim light. Dark hair, pale skin, and eyes wide with terror as he pressed himself against the wall. "You pay what your father owes," one of the men was saying, his voice rough with a thick accent she couldn't place. "Or you learn what happens to little boys who play grown-up games." The largest man reached toward the child, and Zara saw something metallic glint in his hand. Her body moved before her mind caught up, muscle memory from years of protecting herself on these same streets. "Hey!" She stepped into the mouth of the alley, her voice carrying more authority than she felt. "Get away from him." The 3 men turned, and she got her first clear look at their faces. Hard eyes, scarred knuckles, the kind of men who made their living through intimidation. The largest one smiled, but there was nothing friendly in the expression. "Walk away, little girl," he said, not even bothering to hide the knife now. "This doesn't concern you." Zara's hand found the small canister of pepper spray attached to her keychain, while her other hand slipped behind her back to grip the handle of the kitchen knife she always carried after her shift. The blade was sharp from cutting vegetables, and she knew how to use it. "I'm calling the police," she lied, pulling out her phone with exaggerated movements. "They'll be here in 2 minutes." The men exchanged glances. The child whimpered, and the sound cut straight through whatever survival instinct was telling Zara to run. She couldn't leave him. She'd been that terrified child once, waiting for someone to care enough to help. The largest man took a step toward her, but she was ready. The pepper spray caught him full in the face, and he stumbled backward, cursing in what sounded like Russian. His companions hesitated, clearly not expecting resistance from a tired waitress. That hesitation was all she needed. Zara lunged forward, grabbing the child's hand while brandishing the kitchen knife with her free hand. The remaining 2 men backed away, their leader still clutching his burning eyes. "Smart choice," she said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding her system. "Now, get out of here before I really call the cops." They retreated, supporting their blinded companion, but not before the smallest one turned back with a look that promised this wasn't over. "We remember faces," he said quietly. "We remember everything." Zara waited until their footsteps faded before turning her attention to the child. He was shaking, a thin line of blood trickling from a cut above his left eyebrow. His clothes were definitely expensive, designer even, dark slacks and a white button-down shirt that probably cost more than she made in a week. "Are you okay?" she asked gently, kneeling to his eye level. "Do you speak English?" He nodded, but his eyes remained wide with fear. "My name is Minjun," he said, his accent careful and precise. "Those men, They want money from my appa. My father. Where's your father? She asked, looking around the empty alley. How did you get here? Minjun's lower lip trembled. I ran away. It was fighting a home. Shouting. I got scared and ran, but I don't know where I am. Zara's heart clenched. She recognized that look, that bone-deep terror of a child caught in adult problems too big to understand. Without thinking, she reached out and gently touched the cut on his forehead. It wasn't deep, but it needed cleaning. Come on, she said, standing and offering her hand. Let's get you cleaned up, and then we'll figure out how to get you home. She led him back into the diner, flipping the lock behind them and pulling the shade down over the door's window. The fluorescent lights seemed harsh after the darkness of the alley, but Minjun didn't complain as she guided him to a booth near the back. The first aid kit was behind the counter, next to the coffee machine that had been threatening to break down for months. Zara dampened a clean towel with warm water and returned to where Minjun sat, his small hands folded carefully in his lap. This might sting a little, she warned, dabbing gently at the cut. He winced but didn't pull away, watching her face with an intensity that seemed too mature for his age. Why did you help me? He asked quietly. Those men were dangerous. Zara paused in her cleaning, meeting his dark eyes. Because someone should have helped me when I was your age, she said simply. Because you're just a kid, and kids shouldn't have to be scared like that. She finished cleaning the wound and applied a small bandage, then moved to the kitchen to prepare a plate of food. Leftover soup from the day's special, a grilled cheese sandwich, and a glass of milk. When she set it in front of him, his eyes filled with tears. My apple will find me, he said, but there was uncertainty in his voice. He always finds me. Zara slid into the booth across from him, watching as he ate with careful, precise movements. Everything about this child spoke of privilege, of a life far removed from the violence of that alley. So what was he doing here alone? And who were those men who wanted money from his father? Do you remember your phone number? She asked. Your address? Minjun shook his head. Appa says I shouldn't tell strangers those things. But you're not really a stranger anymore, are you? You saved me. The simple trust in his voice made her chest tight. Zara glanced at the clock. Nearly midnight now, and she had no idea what to do with this lost child whose father was apparently involved with dangerous people. She called the police anyway, using the diner's landline while Minjun finished his meal. The dispatcher took down the information with bored efficiency, promising to send a unit when one became available. But something in the woman's tone suggested that might be a long wait. 2 hours passed. Minjun had fallen asleep in the booth, his head pillowed on his arms, looking impossibly young and vulnerable. The police never came, despite 2 follow-up calls. It was as if the report had disappeared into some bureaucratic void. Zara made a decision that would change everything, though she wouldn't understand the magnitude of it until much later. She gently shook Minjun awake and helped him into her jacket, which hung nearly to his knees. Come on, sweetheart, she said softly. Let's get you somewhere safe for the night. The Metro Hotel was 6 blocks away, cheap but clean, the kind of place that didn't ask too many questions as long as you paid in cash. Zara counted out $47 from her tip money and rented a room for the night, signing the register with a fake name. Minjun curled up on the narrow bed, fully clothed, still wearing her jacket like armor against the world. Zara sat in the single chair by the window, watching him sleep and wondering what she'd gotten herself into. She didn't know that 3 blocks away, a black sedan was parked in the shadows, its occupants reviewing footage from the security camera that had captured every moment of the alley confrontation. She didn't know that her face was already being analyzed, her identity confirmed, her life dissected by men whose business was information and control. She didn't know that in helping one frightened child, she had stepped into a world where kindness was a luxury and protection always came with a price. All she knew was that Minjun was safe for now, breathing quietly in the darkness, and that sometimes doing the right thing was enough, even when it changed everything. 3 days passed like a fever dream. Zara had returned Minjun to the hotel lobby that morning after calling every police station in the city, only to be transferred endlessly between departments that claimed no knowledge of a missing Korean child. By afternoon, she was back at the diner, pretending that saving a boy from violent men was just another Tuesday night in her ordinary life. The lunch rush was brutal. Every table filled with construction workers, office employees, and a usual collection of regulars who treated the downtown diner like their personal dining room. Zara moved between tables with practiced efficiency, balancing plates and taking orders while her mind kept drifting back to dark eyes filled with terror and a small voice asking why she had helped. The temperature in the room changed before she saw him. Conversations didn't exactly stop, but they shifted. Voices became quieter, more careful. The construction workers at table 6 glanced toward the entrance and then quickly back at their food. Even the cook, Miguel, who feared nothing and no one, went still behind the order window. Zara turned toward the door and understood immediately why the entire diner had fallen under some invisible spell of caution. The man standing in the doorway was tall, probably 6'2", with broad shoulders that filled out his charcoal suit like it had been crafted specifically for his frame, which, given the obvious quality of the fabric and the precise cut of the jacket, it probably had been. His black hair was styled with careful precision, not a strand out of place despite the October wind outside. But it was his presence that commanded attention. He stood with the stillness of a predator, dark eyes scanning the room with methodical assessment. Behind him, 2 other men flanked the entrance, smaller than their employer, but no less intimidating, wearing dark suits that couldn't quite hide the bulk of concealed weapons. They positioned themselves with military precision, blocking both the front door and the view from the street. Zara's hand tightened around the coffee pot she'd been carrying. Every instinct screamed danger, but there was something familiar about the man's face. The strong jawline, the intelligent dark eyes, the way he held himself with absolute confidence. He looked like Minjun, an older, infinitely more dangerous version, but the resemblance was unmistakable. The man's gaze found her across the crowded diner, and she felt the impact like a physical force. He began walking toward her, moving with fluid grace between the tables. Conversations died completely now. The only sounds the clatter of silverware and the nervous cough of someone trying to break the tension. "Miss Chun," he said when he reached her station by the coffee machine. His voice was rich, accented with precise English that suggested expensive education. "I believe you know my son." Zara set down the coffee pot with careful control, though her heart was racing. "Your son?" "Minjun Kim," he replied, and now she could see the resemblance clearly in the shape of his mouth, the way he tilted his head slightly when speaking. "You saved his life 3 nights ago in the alley behind this establishment." The entire diner was listening now, though everyone was pretending to focus on their meals. Zara was acutely aware of the dozens of pairs of eyes and ears absorbing every word, every gesture. She nodded slowly. "Is he okay?" The question came out before she could stop herself. "I tried to call the police, but they never came. I didn't know what else to do." Something shifted in the man's expression, a fractional softening around his eyes. "He is well, thanks to your intervention. I am Jinwoo Kim, and I have come to express my gratitude." He reached into his jacket with deliberate slowness, clearly aware that sudden movements might be misinterpreted. From an inside pocket, he withdrew a white envelope, thick and substantial. There was no mistaking what it contained. "This is inadequate compensation for what you did," he said, placing the envelope on the counter between them. "But I hope you will accept it as a token of my appreciation." Zara stared at the envelope without touching it. She could feel the weight of everyone's attention, the tension in the room thick enough to cut. Through the order window, she could see Miguel watching with undisguised concern. "I don't want money," she said quietly. "I just wanted to help a scared kid." Jinwa's eyebrows rose slightly, as if her refusal was unexpected. Most people, she suspected, did not turn down his offers. The envelope remained on the counter between them, ignored. "I see," he murmured, and his dark eyes studied her face with increased interest. "You are not what I expected, Miss Chun. What did you expect?" "Someone who understood the value of gratitude when it is offered by certain types of men," he replied, and there was something almost amused in his tone. "Someone who would take the money and ask no questions about why three armed men were threatening a child in an alley. The words carried weight, layers of meaning that Zara was only beginning to understand. This was not a man who dealt in simple transactions or straightforward relationships. Everything about him suggested complexity, danger, power carefully controlled but never fully hidden. What kind of men were they? She asked, though part of her already knew she didn't want to hear the answer. The kind who killed children to send messages to their fathers, Jinwoo replied with chilling matter-of-factness. The kind who will remember your face and consider you a valuable asset to acquire. The temperature in the diner seemed to drop 10 degrees. Zara felt the blood drain from her face as the full implications hit her. By saving Minjun, she had stepped into someone else's war. By being seen, by being remembered, she had made herself a target. Jinwoo was watching her process this information with the patience of a man accustomed to delivering life-changing news. His two companions remained motionless by the door, but their presence felt heavier now, more protective than threatening. I have to go, Zara said, untying her apron with hands that shook only slightly. My shift is almost over anyway. Yes, Jinwoo agreed calmly. You do need to leave, but not alone, and not to your current residence. How do you know where I live? The question came out sharper than she intended. He nodded toward the employee paperwork visible behind the counter, where her address was clearly written on her timesheet. Information, Miss Chun, is remarkably easy to obtain when one knows how to look. Your apartment building has inadequate security, minimal lighting, and multiple points of entry. It would take my enemies approximately 12 minutes to breach your defenses and acquire you. The casual way he discussed her vulnerability made her skin crawl. This man had clearly researched her life with the same methodical precision he brought to everything else. He knew where she lived, where she worked, probably where she shopped, and how she spent her days off. What do you want from me? She asked, though she suspected she already knew. I want to ensure that the woman who saved my son's life does not die because of her kindness, Jinwoo replied. I want to offer you a position in my household, caring for Minjun under my protection. A position, she repeated slowly. You mean a job? I mean survival, he corrected gently. Those men will come for you, Miss Chun. If not today, then tomorrow or next week. They will use you to hurt me, because that is how such conflicts are conducted. Your only choice is whether you accept protection or attempt to face them alone. The lunch crowd was beginning to thin out, but the remaining customers were making no effort to leave. This conversation had become the most interesting thing to happen in the downtown diner in years. Zara was aware of their rapt attention, their barely concealed excitement at witnessing real drama unfold. I need time to think, she said. Time is a luxury you no longer possess, Jinwoo replied, but his tone remained patient. However, I understand that this is overwhelming. Take the remainder of your shift to consider my offer. I will be waiting when you return home this evening to discuss the details. He turned and walked away without waiting for her response, his bodyguards falling into step behind him. The diner remained silent until the door closed behind them, and then conversation exploded like a dam bursting. Girl, you better take that money, called out Mrs. Rodriguez from table 12. Men like that don't make offers twice. But Zara was no longer listening. Her hands moved automatically, clearing tables and refilling coffee cups while her mind raced. Jinwoo Kim was dangerous. That much was obvious. But he was also Minjun's father, and Minjun was just a scared little boy who needed protection in a world where men threatened children to settle adult scores. The rest of her shift passed in a blur. Every customer wanted to know who the man in the expensive suit was, what he wanted, whether she was in some kind of trouble. Zara deflected their questions with non-committal responses, but inside, she was calculating possibilities and probabilities like her life depended on it. Because, apparently, it did. By the time she finished closing duties and took the bus home, the sun had set. Her apartment building looked different somehow, its familiar shabbiness now seeming less like home and more like a trap. She climbed the 3 flights of stairs to her studio apartment, keys ready, scanning the hallway for anything out of place. The door was unlocked. Zara stopped in the hallway, her hand frozen on the doorknob. She knew she had locked it that morning. She was obsessive about locks, about security, about the small rituals that made her feel safe in an unsafe world. The door opened before she could decide whether to run. Jin-woo Kim sat in her single armchair like he belonged there, completely relaxed despite the obvious contrast between his expensive suit and her second-hand furniture. On her small dining table, photographs were spread in neat rows. Black and white surveillance photos that showed her leaving the building, walking to the bus stop, entering the diner. And in several of them, she was not alone. Other figures lurked in doorways, across the street, in cars parked where they shouldn't be. Watching, waiting. "Good evening, Miss Chun," Jin-woo said calmly, as if breaking into her apartment was perfectly normal behavior. "I trust your remaining shift went well. Please sit down. We have much to discuss." Zara remained standing in her own doorway, torn between outrage at the invasion of her privacy and terror at the implications of those photographs. The men watching her weren't Jinwoo's people. She could tell by the way he'd arranged the images, by the clinical detachment in his expression as he studied her reaction. They were the enemy, and they had been hunting her for 3 days. "As you can see," he continued, gesturing toward the photographs, "your situation has become untenable. My offer of employment is generous, but more importantly, it is your only viable option for continued survival." The photographs told a story she didn't want to read. Men with hard faces and cold eyes, tracking her movements, learning her patterns, planning something that would end badly for everyone except them. "What exactly are you proposing?" she asked, finally stepping into the apartment and closing the door behind her. Jin-woo smiled, and for the first time since she'd met him, the expression seemed genuinely warm. "You will live in my home, under my protection. You will serve as Min-jun's companion and tutor, providing him with the stability he desperately needs. In return, you'll be safe, well compensated, and valued as a member of my household. And if I refuse, then you will die," he said simply. "Perhaps tonight, perhaps tomorrow, but certainly within the week. These men do not make idle threats, Miss Chun. They consider you an investment with significant potential return." The weight of inevitability settled on her shoulders like a lead blanket. This wasn't really a choice, despite his polite language and respectful tone. It was an ultimatum delivered with impeccable manners by a man who dealt in life and death as casually as other people discussed the weather. But it was also, she realized, a lifeline thrown by the only person with the power to pull her from the water. "When do I start?" she asked quietly. Jin-woo's smile widened, and she caught a glimpse of the man who had raised a son brave enough to trust a stranger's kindness. "Tonight," he said, rising from her chair with fluid grace. "Pack only what you cannot replace. Everything else will be provided." As Zara moved around her small apartment, gathering the few possessions that truly mattered, she felt like she was performing her own funeral. The life she had built, modest and precarious as it was ending. What came next remained to be seen. But Min-jun would be there, with his 2 serious eyes and careful English, and absolute faith that his Appa would always find him. That had to count for something. Even if she was walking into a cage, at least it would be a cage with purpose. The compound existed in a different world entirely. Zara stood in the marble foyer of Jinwoo's estate, her single duffel bag looking pathetic against the backdrop of soaring ceilings and crystal chandeliers. The scent of expensive leather and sandalwood hung in the air, mixed with the subtle fragrance of fresh flowers arranged in tall vases that probably cost more than her monthly rent. Everything was beautiful, controlled, perfect, and absolutely nothing like home. "Miss Chun," a soft voice said behind her. An elderly Korean woman approached with graceful steps, her silver hair arranged in an elegant chignon. "I am Mrs. Kong, the household manager. Mr. Kim has asked me to show you to your quarters and explain your duties regarding young Min-jun." Zara followed Mrs. Kong through hallways lined with understated artwork and thick carpets that muffled their footsteps. The house felt enormous, all clean lines and expensive materials that spoke of wealth so old it no longer needed to announce itself. Security cameras were positioned at regular intervals, subtle but unmistakable reminders that this paradise came with observation. "Your room is adjacent to Min Jun's suite," Mrs. Kong explained as they climbed a curved staircase with an intricate wrought iron railing. Mr. Kim felt this arrangement would allow you to attend to his needs quickly should he experience any distress during the night. They paused outside a door made of dark wood with brass hardware that gleamed like jewelry. Mrs. Kong opened it with a key she handed to Zara, then stepped back to allow her first glimpse of her new life. The room was larger than her entire apartment had been. A four-poster bed dominated one wall, dressed in cream and gold linens that looked impossibly soft. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered views of manicured gardens where men in dark suits walked discreet patrols among the flowering trees. A sitting area with an antique desk and comfortable chairs occupied the far corner, and two doors led to what appeared to be a walk-in closet and private bathroom. It was beautiful. It was luxurious. It was a cage lined with silk. The clothing in the wardrobe has been selected in your size and appropriate to your position, Mrs. Kong continued, opening the closet door to reveal an array of dresses, blouses, and skirts in muted colors. Conservative but well-made. Mr. Kim prefers his household staff to maintain certain standards of appearance. Zara nodded, running her fingers along the fabric of a navy dress that probably cost more than she made in a month. Everything about this place was a reminder that she no longer controlled the basic aspects of her own existence. Even her clothes were chosen by someone else. "Min Jun's room is through this door," Mrs. Kong said, indicating a connecting entrance Zara hadn't noticed. "He's been asking for you since yesterday. The poor child has had difficulty sleeping since the incident." The mention of Min Jun cut through her overwhelmed thoughts like a blade. Whatever else this arrangement entailed, whatever sacrifices it demanded, there was a little boy who needed her. That had to matter more than her discomfort with designer dresses and marble bathrooms. Mrs. Kong knocked softly on the connecting door before opening it. Min Jun's room was decorated with the careful balance of luxury and childhood. Expensive toys arranged on custom shelves beside books in both Korean and English. The boy himself sat at a small desk by the window, bent over what appeared to be homework. "Min Jun," Mrs. Kong called gently. "Miss Chun has arrived." He looked up, and his entire face transformed with relief and joy. She had forgotten how young he was, how the events in that alley had forced him to carry burdens too heavy for his small shoulders. He crossed the room in 3 quick steps and wrapped his arms around her waist, clinging to her like she was the only solid thing in his world. "You came," he whispered against her shirt. "I was afraid you wouldn't come." Zara's heart clenched as she smoothed his dark hair with gentle fingers. "Of course I came, sweetheart. I promised I'd keep you safe, remember?" Over the next several days, a routine emerged that felt almost natural despite the surreal circumstances. Zara woke each morning in Egyptian cotton sheets and dressed in clothes chosen by someone else, then spent her days with Min Jun in a world that resembled a luxury resort more than a home. They ate breakfast in a sunny alcove off the main kitchen, where a cook named Jungo prepared meals that would have been at home in the finest restaurants. Min Jun was bright, curious, and desperately lonely. His English was excellent, but he switched to Korean when he was tired or upset, leaving Zara to interpret his emotional state through tone and body language. He had been homeschooled since the threats against his family began, isolated from other children for his own protection. The loneliness had marked him, made him crave attention and approval with an intensity that broke her heart. She taught him American games and helped with his English literature assignments. They played chess on a board made of marble and precious stones, and she read him stories about boys who went on adventures and always came home safe. Slowly, his nightmares became less frequent, his smiles more genuine. Jinwoo remained a distant presence those first weeks, a figure glimpsed in hallways or seen through windows as he conducted business in his study. But Zara was always aware of him, conscious of his approval or disapproval in the way the household staff treated her. When he was pleased with Minjun's progress, the atmosphere lightened. When business concerns weighed on him, everyone moved more carefully. She began to understand that Jinwoo's control extended far beyond his son and into every aspect of the people under his protection. The gardeners, the security team, the kitchen staff, all moved in careful choreography directed by his unspoken expectations. It was absolute power wielded with surgical precision, and being subject to it was both terrifying and oddly comforting. The first crack in their professional distance came during Minjun's fourth nightmare of the week. Zara woke to the sound of crying through the connecting door, soft but desperate in the way that meant he was trying not to wake anyone. She found him curled in his bed, clutching a pillow and shaking with sobs that seemed too large for his small body. "Minjun, honey," she whispered, sitting on the edge of his bed. "It's okay. You're safe." But when she reached for him, he pulled away, his eyes wide with the kind of terror that lived in dreams and followed children into the waking world. "Appa," he said in Korean, over and over. "Appa, please don't leave me." Zara was still trying to calm him when the door opened and Jinwoo appeared, wearing silk pajama pants and nothing else. His hair was disheveled from sleep, his expression raw with worry for his son. In the dim light from the hallway, she could see the scars that marked his chest and arms, evidence of a life where violence was commonplace. "What happened?" he asked quietly, moving to the opposite side of Minjun's bed. "Nightmare," Zara replied. "He's been having them more often this week." Jinwoo sat down carefully and began speaking to his son in rapid Korean, his voice gentle and soothing. Minjun turned toward his father like a flower following the sun, his sobs gradually quieting as Jinwoo's large hand stroked his hair. The tenderness in the gesture was so at odds with everything else Zara knew about this man that she felt something shift in her chest, a crack in the careful wall she'd built around her heart. "He blames himself for what happened in the alley," Jinwoo said quietly to Zara as Minjun finally relaxed against him. "He thinks his disobedience led to your involvement and put you in danger." "But that's not true," Zara protested. "None of this is his fault." Jinwoo's dark eyes met hers across his son's small form. "Children often carry guilt that belongs to adults," he said. "It is one of the many ways the world fails them." There was something in his voice, a note of old pain that suggested personal experience with childhood guilt and adult failures. Zara found herself studying his face in the dim light, noting the lines around his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and difficult decisions. For the first time since arriving at the compound, she saw not the powerful crime boss who had taken control of her life, but simply a father worried about his son. "You're good with him," Jinwoo continued after Minjun had fallen back asleep. "Better than the previous governess." She was qualified but cold. "Minjun needs warmth." "What happened to her?" Zara asked. "She requested a transfer after the first attempt on his life," Jinwoo replied matter-of-factly. "Most people are not equipped to care for a child whose existence makes him a target." "But you think I am?" Jinwoo was quiet for a long moment, his hand still resting protectively on his son's shoulder. "You threw yourself between him and armed men without hesitation," he said finally. "You asked for nothing in return. That kind of courage is rare, Miss Chun. It cannot be taught or bought." The compliment settled around her like warmth, unexpected and oddly precious. From a man who dealt in absolute power and life-and-death decisions, recognition of her courage felt significant in ways she couldn't quite articulate. After that night, Jinwoo began joining their evening routines. He would appear in Minjun's room as Zara was finishing the bedtime story, settling into the chair by the window to listen to tales of adventure and heroism. His presence changed the dynamic entirely. Minjun became more animated, eager to demonstrate his English vocabulary and share the day's accomplishments with his father. Jinwoo listened with the same focused attention he brought to everything else, asking thoughtful questions and offering quiet praise that made his son glow with pride. But Zara was aware of his eyes on her as well, assessing her methods, her patience, the genuine affection that grew between her and Minjun with each passing day. The household staff began treating her differently as word spread that Mr. Kim approved of a new governess. Jungo started preparing her favorite foods without being asked. Mrs. Kong consulted her about Minjun's schedule and needs. The security team nodded respectfully when she passed, acknowledging her changed status in the compound's careful hierarchy. She was no longer just an employee under protection. She was becoming something else, something that didn't have a clear definition but carried weight nonetheless. The first real test of their evolving relationship came when Zara decided to challenge one of Jinwoo's rules about Minjun's isolation. "He needs friends," she said one evening after the bedtime story, as Jinwoo lingered in the doorway of Minjun's room. Children his age require social interaction with their peers. Jinwoo's expression became guarded, the walls sliding back into place with almost audible finality. "The world outside this compound is dangerous for him," he said. "Other children represent security risks that cannot be adequately controlled. But isolation is damaging him too," Zara pressed, surprising herself with her boldness. "He's lonely, Jinwoo. He's becoming too attached to the adults in his life because he has no other options." Something flickered in Jinwoo's dark eyes at her use of his given name instead of the formal Mr. Kim she'd been carefully maintaining. But instead of the anger she expected, he seemed thoughtful, considering her words with the same serious attention he gave everything else. "What do you propose?" he asked finally. "There are other children of your business associates, aren't there?" she asked. "Other families who understand the security concerns? Maybe carefully supervised playdates here at the compound?" Jinwoo was quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving between her face and his sleeping son. "The protection of those relationships would require extensive coordination," he said slowly. "Background checks, security protocols, absolute trust between families." "But it's possible?" Zara asked hopefully. "It is possible," he agreed, and she saw something like respect flicker in his expression. "I will make inquiries." The fact that he was even considering her suggestion felt like a victory, a small crack in the absolute authority that governed every aspect of life in the compound. More importantly, it felt like partnership, a recognition that her voice mattered in decisions affecting Minjun's welfare. As she prepared for bed that night, Zara caught herself thinking about the scent of sandalwood that clung to Jinwoo's skin, the way his rare smiles transformed his entire face, the gentleness in his voice when he spoke to his son. These thoughts were dangerous, she knew. This man controlled every aspect of her existence, held her life in his hands as casually as he held his morning coffee. But he had listened to her concerns about Minjun. He had valued her opinion enough to consider changing long-established security protocols. And when she'd seen him comforting his son, she'd caught a glimpse of the man beneath the dragon, the father who would move heaven and earth to protect the child who was his whole world. That glimpse was enough to plant seeds of something that felt perilously close to trust. And trust, in Jinwoo Kim's world, was the most dangerous emotion of all. Minjun's fever spiked at 2 in the morning, turning his small body into a furnace that no amount of cool cloths could tame. Zara had been checking on him every hour since he'd complained of feeling tired at dinner, some instinct warning her that this was more than simple fatigue. Now, as she pressed the back of her hand to his burning forehead, her fears crystallized into sharp-edged worry. 104 degrees. Too high. Dangerously high for a child his size. She was reaching for her phone to call for medical help when the bedroom door opened and Jinwoo appeared, still dressed in the dark suit he'd worn to his evening meetings. His tie was loosened, his hair slightly disheveled, but his eyes were instantly alert as he took in the scene. "How long has he been this warm?" he asked, moving to the opposite side of Minjun's bed with the fluid efficiency that marked all his actions. "About an hour, but it's getting worse," Zara replied, wringing out another cool cloth. "I think we should call a doctor." Jinwoo was already pulling out his phone, speaking in rapid Korean to someone on the other end. While he made arrangements, Zara continued her careful ministrations, bathing Minjun's fevered skin with cool water and murmuring soft reassurances whenever he stirred. "Dr. Park will be here within 20 minutes, Jinwoo said, ending his call. "He has been Minjun's physician since birth. We can trust him completely." The next few hours passed in a blur of medical consultations, temperature monitoring, and the careful administration of fever reducers that slowly began to bring Min-jun's temperature down. Dr. Park, a distinguished man in his 60s, diagnosed a severe case of influenza and prescribed rest, fluids, and careful observation. The fever should break by tomorrow evening, he assured them as he packed his medical bag. But someone should remain with him through the night. Children could deteriorate quickly with influenza. I'll stay, Zara said immediately, settling back into the chair she'd claimed beside Min-jun's bed. As will I, Jinwoo added, surprising both Zara and the doctor. After Dr. Park left, the compound settled into the deep quiet of late night. Min-jun slept fitfully, his breathing shallow and rapid, occasionally murmuring in Korean as fever dreams claimed him. Zara maintained her vigil from the bedside chair, while Jinwoo positioned himself in the window seat, close enough to help, but far enough to avoid crowding the sick room. The hours stretched between them, marked by the soft sounds of Min-jun's labored breathing and the periodic rustle of movement as one of them checked his temperature or adjusted his blankets. There was something intimate about sharing this worry, this protective watch over a vulnerable child. The formal boundaries that usually governed their interactions seemed to dissolve in the face of parental concern. You don't have to stay, Zara said quietly around 3 in the morning, when Min-jun's fever finally seemed to be stabilizing. I can manage the night shift alone. Jinwoo looked up from the business papers he'd been reviewing by the window. His expression was soft in the dim light from the bedside lamp, less guarded than she'd ever seen it. I want to be here, he said simply. When my wife was ill, I was often away on business. I told myself the work was necessary, that providing security for our family required my absence. But she died while I was in meetings, surrounded by doctors and nurses instead of the people who loved her. The confession hung between them, raw and unexpected. Zara had wondered about Min-jun's mother, about the woman who had shared Jinwoo's life before danger and necessity reshaped everything. She'd assumed death or divorce, but had never dared ask about something so personal. How long ago? She asked gently. 3 years, Jinwoo replied. Cancer. By the time we caught it, the disease had already taken too much. She fought bravely, but cancer does not respect courage or determination or the love of those who would die to save you. His voice carried the weight of old grief, carefully controlled but never fully healed. Zara found herself studying his profile in the dim light, noting the tension in his jaw, the way his hand had stilled on the papers he'd been pretending to read. Min-jun looks like her, he continued after a moment. The same delicate features, the same thoughtful expressions. Sometimes I see her so clearly in his face that it feels like she's still here, watching over us both. He talks about her sometimes, Zara said softly. When he's tired or scared, he'll mention his Uma. He says she's watching from heaven. Jinwoo's smile was sad but genuine. She would have loved you, he said. Soo-jin believed that children needed fierce protectors, people who would fight for them without counting the cost. She would have recognized that quality in you immediately. The comparison to a woman she'd never met, but whose absence shaped this household, felt significant, weighted with implications Zara wasn't sure she was ready to examine. Instead, she found herself sharing truths she rarely voiced aloud. I never had that, she said quietly. Fierce protectors, I mean. I spent most of my childhood moving between foster homes, learning not to expect too much from the adults who were supposed to care for me. That's probably why I can't walk away when I see a child in trouble. Jinwoo set aside his papers completely, giving her his full attention. How many homes? He asked. 11, from the time I was 7 until I aged out at 18. Some were better than others, but none of them felt permanent. I learned early that the only person I could really count on was myself. And yet you risked your safety for Min-jun without hesitation, Jinwoo observed. Despite having no one to protect you, you chose to protect someone else's child. Someone had to, Zara replied simply. He was scared and alone, and I remembered what that felt like. I couldn't just walk away. Jinwoo rose from the window seat and moved closer to where she sat beside Min-jun's bed. In the dim light, his features seemed softer, more approachable. The dangerous crime lord had been replaced by something more human, more vulnerable. "You have given my son something I cannot provide," he said quietly. "The knowledge that there are people in the world who will help simply because it is the right thing to do." He was beginning to believe that kindness was weakness, that only power and fear could protect him. "You have shown him a different truth." Their faces were very close now, close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his dark eyes, smell the sandalwood scent that seemed to cling to his skin. The air between them felt charged with possibilities neither had acknowledged aloud. "Zara," he said softly, and her name on his lips sounded different than it ever had before. Less formal, more intimate, like a secret being shared. She found herself leaning toward him, drawn by something deeper than physical attraction. This man who controlled everything and everyone with absolute authority was showing her his wounds, his fears, his love for his son. The vulnerability was more seductive than any display of power could have been. Their lips were almost touching when the security alarm shrieked through the compound, shattering the moment like glass. Jinwoo was instantly alert, his hand moving to the weapon concealed beneath his jacket as he moved toward the window to assess the threat. "False alarm," came a voice through the intercom system. "Dear," triggered the perimeter sensors in Sector 7. All clear, but the spell was broken. The intimacy of the moment dissolved, replaced by the stark reminder of where they were and why. This wasn't a normal household where attraction could be explored naturally. This was a fortress where every relationship carried consequences, where emotions could be weaponized by enemies who watched for weakness. "I should check the kitchen," Zara said, rising from her chair with careful composure. "Minjun might want juice when he wakes up." She fled the room before Jinwoo could respond, her heart pounding with a mixture of desire and terror. What had she been thinking? This man held her life in his hands. He could send her away or keep her prisoner on a whim. Getting emotionally involved with him would be the height of foolishness. But even as she tried to rationalize away what had happened between them, she could still feel the warmth of his breath on her skin, still hear the way her name had sounded when he spoke it like a prayer. The next morning brought Minjun's fever break and Zara's desperate attempt to reassert some control over her situation. She woke feeling off balance, hyper-aware of every interaction with Jinwoo, every casual comment that might be interpreted as something more than professional courtesy. When Mrs. Kong mentioned that Mr. Kim had arranged for additional security during Minjun's illness, Zara found herself bristling at yet another decision made without her input. "I would like to take Minjun to the garden this afternoon," she announced during lunch, her voice carrying more challenge than she'd intended. "Fresh air will help his recovery. The outdoor spaces are not secure during daylight hours when the gardening staff is present," Jinwoo replied from his position at the head of the dining table. "Minjun will remain inside until his health is fully restored. He's not contagious anymore, and he's been cooped up for 3 days," Zara pressed. "A short walk in supervised areas would be beneficial." "My son's safety takes precedence over therapeutic benefits," Jinwoo said, his tone becoming cooler, more distant. "The decision is final." Something snapped inside Zara at the casual dismissal, the absolute authority delivered without room for discussion. She was tired of being grateful for beautiful cages, exhausted by the constant reminder that nothing in this house belonged to her, including her own opinions. "I see," she said, setting down her fork with deliberate precision. "And am I allowed to have opinions about his care? Or am I simply expected to follow orders without question?" Jinwoo's eyes narrowed dangerously, and she saw the shift from concerned father to powerful crime lord happen in real time. When he spoke, his voice carried the chill of absolute authority. "You are allowed to have opinions, Miss Chun. You are not allowed to question my decisions regarding my son's security in my house under my protection." The formal address stung more than it should have, a deliberate reminder of the professional boundaries she'd been foolish enough to think were softening. But instead of backing down, Zara found herself leaning into the confrontation. "Then perhaps you should have hired a robot instead of a human being," she said, her own voice sharpening with anger. "Robots don't have inconvenient opinions or concerns about the children in their care." The silence that followed was electric with tension. Mrs. Kong had quietly retreated to the kitchen. Even the household staff seemed to sense the dangerous undercurrents and made themselves scarce. Only Minjun remained, watching the exchange between the two most important adults in his life with growing distress. "Appa," he said quietly, tugging at Jinwoo's sleeve. "Zaranuna just wants to help me feel better." Jinwoo's expression softened fractionally at his son's intervention, but his eyes remained locked on Zara's face. "You are right that I could have hired someone more compliant," he said finally. "Someone who would follow orders without question or challenge. But such a person would not have thrown herself between my son and armed men in an alley. They would not have sat beside his sickbed all night, fighting his fever with the dedication of a mother protecting her own child." The words hit their mark with surgical precision, acknowledging the very dedication that made her challenging while pointing out the impossibility of separating her protective instinct from her defiant independence. "I don't want you to be compliant, Zara," he continued, and the return of her first name felt like a small victory. "But I also cannot allow concerns for Minjun's emotional well-being to override security protocols that keep him alive." Before Zara could respond, Minjun's small voice cut through the adult tension with devastating innocence. "Are you going to be my new Oma?" he asked, looking directly at Zara with the earnest hope that only children could manage. "Jungo says that Apple likes you very much, and that maybe you'll stay forever like Uma did." The question hit the room like a bomb, exploding all the careful pretense and professional distance that had been steadily eroding since her arrival. Zara felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment and something deeper, more complicated. Jinwoo looked as if he'd been physically struck, his carefully controlled expression cracking to reveal something raw and uncertain. "Minjun," Jinwoo said gently, but with obvious strain. "Miss Chun is here to help take care of you, not to be your new mother. But she takes care of me like Uma did." Minjun pressed, his innocent logic cutting through adult complications with ruthless efficiency. "And she makes Appa smile the way he used to smile at Uma. I saw you almost kiss her last night." The blood drained from Zara's face as she realized that Minjun had been more aware during his fever than they'd assumed. Jinwoo's jaw clenched, and she could see him struggling between parental gentleness and the need to establish boundaries that protected them all from dangerous expectations. "I need some air," Zara said abruptly, rising from the table before either father or son could respond. She fled to the garden despite Jinwoo's security concerns, needing space to think without the weight of their expectations and her own confused feelings. The afternoon sun felt harsh after the controlled climate of the house, but the reality of being outdoors helped ground her in practical concerns instead of emotional chaos. She had been in the garden for perhaps an hour when Jinwoo found her, approaching with the cautious movements of a man unsure of his reception. He'd changed from his business suit into dark jeans and a white button-down shirt, the casual clothes making him seem more approachable, but no less dangerous. "Minjun is napping," he said, settling beside her on the stone bench where she'd been attempting to sort through her thoughts. "He asked me to apologize for embarrassing you at lunch." "He's 8 years old," Zara replied without looking at him. "He doesn't understand what he's suggesting, doesn't he?" Jinwoo asked quietly. Children often see truths that adults try to hide from themselves. The comment hung between them, loaded with implications neither seemed ready to address directly. Zara found herself studying her hands, noting the way they trembled slightly despite her best efforts to appear composed. "This is impossible," she said finally. "Whatever this is between us, it can't happen. You control everything in my life, Jinwoo. My housing, my work, my safety, my future. Any feelings I might develop could just be some kind of psychological response to that level of dependence." "Stockholm Syndrome," Jinwoo said calmly. "You're worried about Stockholm Syndrome." The clinical term for her fears made them sound less overwhelming, more manageable. "Yes," she admitted. "How would I ever know if what I feel is real or just a survival mechanism?" Jinwoo was quiet for a long moment, considering her concern with the same serious attention he gave all problems that mattered to him. "You would know," he said finally, "because you are not a woman who mistakes dependence for affection. Everything about your history suggests someone who values independence above comfort, who chooses difficult truth over pleasant illusion. If you cared for me, it would be despite my control over your circumstances, not because of it. His faith in her character was both flattering and terrifying, suggesting a level of understanding that went deeper than their professional arrangement. But it also raised questions about his own feelings, the motivation behind his careful observation of her responses and reactions. "What about you?" she asked, finally meeting his dark gaze. "How do you separate protectiveness from possession? Gratitude from genuine feeling?" Jinwoo's smile was rueful, acknowledging the complexity of their situation without offering easy answers. "I don't know," he admitted. "I have spent 3 years focusing solely on Minjun's needs, avoiding emotional complications that might compromise my judgment or create vulnerabilities our enemies could exploit. But watching you with my son, seeing the way you fight for his happiness even when it means challenging me, has awakened feelings I thought I had buried with my wife." The honesty was devastating in its simplicity, cutting through all the rational objections and practical concerns to the heart of what was happening between them. They were two people finding connection in impossible circumstances, fighting an attraction that could complicate everything while trying to protect a child who desperately needed them both. "So what do we do?" Zara asked quietly. "We proceed carefully," Jinwoo replied, reaching over to cover her hand with his own. "We acknowledge what exists between us without rushing toward conclusions that neither of us is ready to reach. We focus on Minjun's needs while remaining honest about our own. And if it becomes too complicated, then we will deal with those complications as they arise," he said simply. "But I will not send you away, Zara. Not unless you choose to leave." The promise felt like both a gift and a threat, removing the fear of abandonment while highlighting the cage of golden opportunity that surrounded her. But looking into Jinwoo's eyes, seeing the genuine care and respect alongside the heat of attraction, Zara thought that perhaps some cages were worth choosing, even if walking into them meant risking everything she'd worked to protect in herself. The attack came on a Tuesday afternoon, during what should have been a simple visit to the Children's Museum in the city center. Jinwoo had finally agreed to Minjun's request for an outing, a carefully orchestrated excursion involving advanced security sweeps, alternate routes, and enough firepower to protect a small army. What they hadn't anticipated was the level of coordination their enemies had achieved, or the depth of intelligence they possessed about the family's movements. Minjun was examining a display about Korean traditional crafts when Zara noticed the man with the newspaper. He'd been at the coffee shop across from the museum entrance when they arrived, and now he was inside, still pretending to read while his eyes tracked their movements with predatory focus. The newspaper was in Russian. The recognition hit her like ice water. These were the men from the alley, or others like them. They had found Minjun again, despite all the security measures, despite the fortress-like compound and the armed guards who shadowed their every step. "Jinwoo," she said quietly, moving closer to where he stood supervising Minjun's exploration. "The man by the entrance. He was at the coffee shop when we arrived." Jinwoo's gaze flicked toward the stranger with casual precision, but Zara saw his entire body shift into a different state of alertness. His hand moved fractionally closer to his jacket, where she knew he carried a weapon despite the museum's prohibition on firearms. "Take Minjun to the bathroom," he said, his voice calm but carrying absolute authority. "Lock the door and wait for my signal." But before Zara could move, the lights went out. Emergency lighting flickered on as the museum's main power grid failed, casting everything in eerie red shadows. Somewhere in the darkness, a child screamed. Then gunfire erupted from multiple directions, the sharp crack of pistols mixing with the deeper bark of automatic weapons. Jinwoo moved like liquid death, his weapon appearing in his hand with practiced efficiency. He fired twice in rapid succession, and the man with the newspaper dropped without a sound. But more figures were emerging from the emergency exits, from behind displays, from positions they'd clearly scouted in advance. "This way," Jinwoo commanded, grabbing Minjun with his free hand while continuing to fire at advancing threats. His security team materialized from their discreet positions, forming a protective barrier around the family as they fought their way toward the rear exit. Zara scooped Minjun into her arms, pressing his face against her shoulder to shield him from the violence exploding around them. The boy clung to her with desperate strength, his small body shaking with terror, but making no sound that might give away their position. The museum had become a war zone. Glass cases exploded under gunfire, sending razor-sharp fragments across the floor. Ancient artifacts, irreplaceable pieces of history, were destroyed in seconds as bullets found their targets with lethal precision. The few remaining visitors had taken cover behind whatever shelter they could find, their screams mixing with the deafening sound of automatic weapons. Jinwoo's transformation was complete and terrifying. Gone was any pretense of civilized businessman or gentle father. This was the predator his reputation promised, moving through the chaos with calculated lethality that left bodies in his wake. He protected his family with the focused brutality of a man who understood that mercy was a luxury he couldn't afford. But there were too many attackers, and they had planned this assault with military precision. As Jinwoo's security team began to fall under concentrated fire, it became clear that they were outgunned and surrounded. The service tunnels, one of Jinwoo's remaining guards, shouted over the gunfire. Emergency exit through the basement. They fought their way through a maintenance door, down narrow stairs that led to the museum's service level. The walls here were concrete and steel, providing better cover, but also trapping them in a maze of corridors that could become their tomb if the enemy reached the exits first. Minjun had stopped shaking in Zara's arms, his body gone limp with the kind of shock that came when terror exceeded a child's capacity to process it. She murmured soft reassurances in his ear, while Jinwoo led them through the underground passages, his remaining men covering their retreat with steady, professional gunfire. The tunnel that led to the parking structure was their salvation and their trap. It offered escape from the museum, but if enemies were waiting at the other end, they would be caught in a killing zone with no cover and nowhere to run. Jinwoo paused at the tunnel entrance, speaking rapidly into his radio in Korean. Whatever response he received made his jaw tighten with grim determination. "They have the exits covered," he said quietly to Zara. "But there's another way." He led them through a maintenance hatch that opened onto the city's storm drain system. The tunnels were dark, damp, and filled with the echoing sound of their footsteps on wet concrete. But they were also unguarded, a path their enemies hadn't anticipated. 15 minutes of underground navigation brought them to a drainage outlet near the river. Jinwoo's backup security team was waiting with armored vehicles, their faces grim with the news that the primary extraction had been compromised. The safe house was 20 minutes away, a nondescript apartment building in a neighborhood that looked nothing like the luxury of the compound. But it was secure, equipped with everything they needed to wait out the immediate danger while Jinwoo's people hunted down the surviving attackers. Only when they were behind locked doors, with armed guards posted at every entrance, did Jinwoo allow himself to examine his family for injuries. Minjun was unharmed physically but deeply traumatized, his eyes vacant with the kind of shock that could leave permanent scars. Jinwoo carried his son to the bedroom, speaking to him in soft Korean while Zara prepared warm milk and found blankets to combat the shivers that had nothing to do with temperature. It was only after Minjun had finally fallen into exhausted sleep that Jinwoo allowed his own control to crack. Zara found him in the safe house kitchen, standing motionless at the window that overlooked the street. His hands were shaking, barely perceptible tremors that spoke of adrenaline crash and emotional overload. When he turned toward her, his face was raw with emotions he'd been suppressing since the first gunshot. "I almost lost you both," he said, his voice breaking on the words. "If they had been better prepared, if we had been seconds slower, if any of 100 variables had shifted, you would both be dead because I allowed myself to believe that normal activities were possible." The guilt in his voice was devastating, the self-recrimination of a man who understood that love made him vulnerable in ways that could destroy everything he was trying to protect. "But we're safe," Zara said, stepping closer. Your planning, your security, your quick thinking saved us all. My arrogance nearly killed you, Jinwoo corrected harshly. I knew the risks and chose to ignore them because my son wanted to see dinosaur bones, and you thought he needed normal experiences. I chose sentiment over security, and it nearly cost me everything that matters. The pain in his voice cut through her own lingering fear, replacing it with fierce protectiveness for this man who carried impossible burdens with such determined strength. She moved closer, drawn by his vulnerability and her own need to offer comfort. "Look at me," she said, reaching up to cup his face in her hands. "We are alive. Minjun is safe. Your love for us, your desire to give him normal childhood experiences, that's not weakness. That's what makes you more than just a man with guns and power." Jinwoo's hands came up to cover hers, his eyes closing as if her touch was both salvation and torture. "I can't lose you," he whispered, the words torn from somewhere deep in his chest. "Either of you. I thought I could keep this professional, that I could protect you both without risking everything. But watching those men come for my son, knowing they would hurt you to get to me, I realized that my feelings have already made the choice impossible." Before Zara could respond, his mouth found hers with desperate hunger. 3 months of suppressed attraction and growing love finally breaking free of the constraints that had held them both prisoner. She met his kiss with equal fervor, her own need driving away the last vestiges of rational thought about power dynamics and professional boundaries. This was not gentle exploration or tentative affection. This was claiming possession, the desperate need of two people who had faced death together and emerged more connected than before. Jinwoo's hands tangled in her hair, pulling her closer as if he could absorb her into his skin and keep her safe through sheer force of will. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard, foreheads pressed together in the sudden stillness of the safe house kitchen. "This changes everything," Zara whispered, stating the obvious because someone needed to acknowledge the magnitude of what had just happened between them. "Yes," Jinwoo agreed, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw with reverent gentleness. "Everything." From the bedroom came the soft sound of Minjun stirring, calling out for them both in the universal language of a child seeking comfort from the adults who represented safety in a frightening world. They went to him together, settling on either side of the narrow bed as he reached for both of them with desperate need. "Are the bad men gone?" Minjun asked in a small voice, his English carefully controlled despite his obvious distress. "Yes," Jinwoo said firmly, his hands smoothing his son's dark hair. "They can't hurt you anymore. I promise. Will you both stay with me?" Minjun asked, his eyes moving between his father and Zara with the hope of a child who had seen his world threatened and needed the security of his chosen family intact. "We'll both stay," Zara said, making the promise before she could question the implications or consider the complications it represented. As Minjun drifted back to sleep between them, Zara felt the last of her resistance crumble. Whatever this relationship was, whatever dangers it represented, she was committed now. The kiss had been a declaration, an acceptance of feelings that could no longer be denied or rationalized away. Jinwoo's hand found hers across Minjun's sleeping form, his fingers intertwining with hers in a gesture that felt like both anchor and promise. They had moved beyond protection and employment, beyond the careful professional distance that had governed their interactions since her arrival at the compound. They had moved into love, with all its terrible vulnerabilities and its power to transform the most dangerous man in the city into someone who shook at the thought of losing the people who had become his heart. The attack had been meant to destroy them. Instead, it had forged them into something stronger than the sum of their individual parts. A family born of choice rather than blood, protected by love as much as by guns, united by the understanding that some things were worth any risk to defend. In the morning, they would return to the compound and deal with the practical aftermath of the assault. Security would be reviewed and strengthened. The surviving attackers would be hunted down with methodical precision. Life would resume its carefully controlled rhythms. But everything will be different now. The cage had become a sanctuary. Protection had evolved into partnership, and the dangerous man who controlled everything had surrendered the most important part of himself to the woman brave enough to love him despite the costs. 1 week after the museum attack, the threat that had brought them together ceased to exist. Jinwoo's response to the assault on his family had been swift, methodical, and absolutely final. The remaining members of the rival faction were neutralized with the kind of professional efficiency that reminded everyone why crossing the Kim family was considered a terminal mistake. Zara learned about the resolution not from Jinwoo directly, but from the subtle changes in the compound's atmosphere. Security patrols were reduced. Staff moved with less tension. The armed guards who had been stationed outside Minjun's bedroom were quietly reassigned to other duties. The war was over, which meant the protection arrangement that had brought her into Jinwoo's world was no longer necessary. She was sitting in the garden when he found her, enjoying the afternoon sun and watching Minjun play with the new puppy Jinwoo had bought to help him process the trauma of the attack. The boy's laughter rang across the manicured grounds as the golden retriever puppy tumbled over itself in enthusiastic pursuit of a tennis ball. "It's finished," Jinwoo said, settling beside her on the stone bench where they'd had their first honest conversation about feelings and complications. "I know," Zara replied quietly. "I could tell from the way Mrs. Kong was humming while she arranged flowers this morning." Jinwoo's smile was slight but genuine. She only hums when she feels the household is truly secure. It has been a reliable indicator of our family's safety for over a decade. The word family hung between them, loaded with implications and possibilities that had been evolving since the night they'd almost kissed over Minjun's sickbed. But there was something in Jinwoo's voice, a careful neutrality that suggested this conversation was not going in the direction her heart hoped. "You're free to go," he said simply, the words cutting through her thoughts like a blade. "The contract that brought you here is fulfilled. The debt of gratitude has been paid in full. You may leave whenever you choose, with enough financial security to begin any life you desire." The offer was everything she should want. Freedom, independence, enough money to pursue any dream without concern for survival. It was the fairy tale ending to an impossible situation, complete liberation from the golden cage that had housed her for months. But it felt like dying. "Is that what you want?" she asked, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "For me to leave?" Jinwoo was quiet for a long moment, watching Minjun's joyful play with an expression that revealed nothing of his inner thoughts. "What I want," he said finally, "is for you to have a real choice. For months, you have been here because circumstances demanded it, because the alternative was death or danger. That is not the foundation for a life together, Zura. It is a beautiful prison, but still a prison. And now you can choose freely, without coercion or necessity driving your decision. If you stay, it will be because you want this life, this family me. If you leave, it will be because freedom matters more than whatever we've built together." The choice was simultaneously everything she'd wanted and the most terrifying decision of her life. Staying meant accepting love that came with power and danger, choosing a man whose world would always carry risks. Leaving meant safety and independence, but also abandoning the child who had become like her own son and the man who had somehow become essential to her happiness. Minjun's laughter drew their attention as he ran toward them, the puppy bounding behind him with uncontainable energy. "Appa, Zaranuna," he called breathlessly. Baram caught the ball 3 times in a row. "He's going to be the smartest dog in the whole city." "Baram," Jinwoo repeated, raising an eyebrow. "Storm? He's golden like sunshine, but he runs like a whirlwind," Minjun explained with 80-year-old logic that made perfect sense to him. "Just like how Zaranuna came into our house like a storm and made everything bright." The innocent observation hit both adults with devastating accuracy. Zara had indeed stormed into their controlled world, bringing chaos and warmth in equal measure, transforming the fortress into something that felt like home. Minjun settled between them on the bench, the puppy collapsing at his feet in the sudden exhaustion that came to young things after intense play. "Are you staying forever now?" Minjun asked Zara, with the directness that children wielded like surgical instruments. "The bad men can't hurt us anymore. so you don't have to be scared. Out of the mouths of babes. The question she'd been wrestling with, delivered with such innocent clarity that it cut straight to the heart of the matter. Fear wasn't what had kept her here these past months. It was love, complicated and dangerous, and absolutely worth the risks. I would like to stay, she said, looking not at Minjun, but at Jinwoo. If your Appa wants me to be part of your family. Jinwoo's composure finally cracked, revealing the hope and love he'd been holding in careful check. But when he spoke, his words were measured, formal in a way that suggested something important was happening. Minjun, he said gently, I need to ask Zara something very important. Would you take Baram inside and ask Mrs. Kong for his afternoon treats? The boy looked between them with the sharp intelligence that missed very little, then grinned with delight as he realized what might be about to happen. Are you going to ask her to marry us? He whispered loudly, causing both adults to laugh despite the seriousness of the moment. Perhaps, Jinwoo replied. If she says yes, she will, Minjun said with absolute confidence. She loves us. I can tell. After the boy and puppy had bounded toward the house, Jinwoo stood and began pacing the small garden space with nervous energy that was completely at odds with his usual controlled composure. This is not how I planned to do this, he said, running a hand through his hair. I had intended something more formal, more worthy of the magnitude of what I'm asking. What are you asking? Zara said softly, though her heart was already racing with anticipation. Jinwoo stopped pacing and dropped to one knee beside her bench, reaching into his jacket to withdraw a small velvet box that seemed to contain every possible future she might choose. I am asking you to marry me, he said, his voice steady despite the vulnerability in his eyes. Not because circumstances demand it, not because it serves some practical purpose, but because I love you, because you have become essential to my happiness and Minjun's sense of family. Because I want to spend my life protecting and cherishing the woman brave enough to save a stranger's child in a dark alley. He opened the box to reveal a ring that perfectly captured the complexity of their relationship. The center stone was a flawless diamond, traditional and beautiful, but it was flanked by smaller stones in deep blue sapphires that caught the light like captured starfire. Classic elegance with unexpected depths, valuable beyond measure, but not ostentatious. The ring my wife wore was buried with her, he continued quietly. This is new, chosen specifically for you, for the life we would build together. I'm not asking you to replace what I lost, Zara. I am asking you to become something entirely new. The proposal was everything she hadn't dared to hope for, offered freely without coercion or the pressure of external circumstances. This was choice in its purest form, love offered without conditions or survival attached. Yes, she said, the word coming out as barely more than a whisper. Yes, I will marry you. Jinwoo's smile was radiant as he slipped the ring on her finger, the perfect fit feeling like destiny rather than coincidence. When he rose and pulled her into his arms, their kiss tasted like promises and possibilities, like the end of one story and the beginning of something even better. Minjun's delighted shriek from the house suggested that he had been watching from the windows, his joy carrying across the garden like music. By the time they broke apart, he was racing toward them with Baram at his heels and Mrs. Kong following at a more dignified pace, her face bright with approval. The wedding, 3 weeks later, was a perfect blend of traditions old and new, Korean customs interwoven with touches that honored Zara's preferences and their unique circumstances. The ceremony took place in the compound's garden, transformed into something magical with thousands of white flowers and traditional lanterns that cast everything in warm, golden light. Zara wore a hanbok of silk in deep burgundy and gold, the traditional Korean dress that Minjun had specifically requested because he wanted her to look like a real Korean mother. But she also carried a bouquet of wildflowers, the kind that grew in empty lots and survived against impossible odds, a reminder of the strength that had brought them together. Jinwoo's family and business associates filled the garden, men who wielded power and women who commanded respect, all gathered to witness the marriage of their leader to the woman who had fought armed men to protect the child. The acceptance in their faces was complete, recognition that she belonged in this world not because she had been rescued into it, but because she had proven herself worthy of it. Minjun served as ring-bearer with serious dignity, his small face glowing with joy as he watched the two people he loved most promise to love each other forever. When the officiant asked if anyone objected to the union, he called out loudly that everyone better say yes, or they would have to deal with him and Baram, causing laughter to ripple through the gathered crowd. The kiss that sealed their marriage was soft, reverent, full of promises for the future they would build together. But it was also heated with the passion that had been building between them since that first almost kiss in Minjun's bedroom, the desire that had been tempered by necessity and strengthened by choice. As they were introduced as husband and wife, Zara caught sight of the security cameras that still monitored the compound, the guards who still walked discreet patrols, the subtle signs that Jinwoo's world would always carry certain dangers. But she also saw Minjun's face, radiant with happiness at finally having the complete family he dreamed of, and she knew that some risks were worth taking. The reception celebration continued long into the night, but eventually the couple escaped to the privacy of their shared suite, decorated with rose petals and lit by candles that Mrs. Khan had arranged with romantic precision. "Do you have any regrets?" Jinwoo asked as they stood together on the balcony overlooking the garden where their guests were still celebrating. "Only that it took us so long to get here," Zara replied, settling into his arms with the perfect fit of two people who had been designed for each other. 6 months later, as autumn painted the compound's gardens in shades of gold and crimson, Zara stood in the same spot where Jinwoo had proposed, watching Minjun teach Baram new tricks with the patience of someone who understood that the best things in life required time and dedication to develop properly. Her hand rested on the gentle swell of her belly, where their child grew with the quiet persistence of new life taking root in fertile ground. The pregnancy had been a surprise, but not an unwelcome one. Another layer of commitment and joy added to the family they had chosen to build together. Jinwoo emerged from the house, carrying afternoon tea, moving with the careful attention to her comfort that had marked his behavior since they'd learned about the baby. But there was something else in his expression, a particular satisfaction that suggested good news. The expansion project was approved, he said, settling beside her and pulling her close. "The new children's center will break ground next month." Zara smiled, thinking of the community outreach program they had developed together, funded by the Kim Family Foundation and designed to provide safe spaces and educational opportunities for at-risk children in the city. It was their way of giving back, of ensuring that other vulnerable children might have better options than dark alleys and dangerous strangers. Minjun bounded over to them, Baram at his side, his face bright with excitement about his upcoming role as big brother. He had been planning his siblings' education and entertainment for months, determined to be the best teacher and protector a baby could ask for. "Do you think the baby will like dogs?" he asked, settling cross-legged on the grass beside them. "Because Baram is very good with children, and I want to make sure they'll be best friends." "I think the baby will love Baram," Zara assured him, watching as Jinwoo's hand joined hers on her belly, his touch reverent and protective. This was their life now, built from the ashes of circumstances that had seemed impossible to survive. The dangerous man had become her sanctuary. The cage had transformed into a chosen home, and the protection arrangement had evolved into the deepest partnership she could imagine. Sometimes, in the quiet moments between Minjun's laughter and Jinwoo's gentle touches, Zara marveled at the journey that had brought them here. A scared child in an alley had needed help, and in helping him, she had found everything she'd never known she was searching for. Have you ever experienced a moment when helping someone else changed your own life completely? I'd love to hear about the unexpected connections that have shaped your story. Share your thoughts in the comments about the power of choosing love, even when it comes with risks. The compound's gardens stretched before them in the afternoon light, beautiful and secure, filled with the sounds of family and the promise of futures yet to be written. They had found there forever in the most unlikely circumstances, and every day forward would be a choice to keep choosing each other, to keep building something beautiful from the foundation of courage and love.